Hello and welcome back to Medical Compliance with Clarissa. I'm Clarissa Benfield, our Global Director and Business Line Leader for our medical, laboratory, and life safety and security businesses. And today I am so excited to be joined by not one, but two guests on today's podcast. One who has been a guest previously and then a new guest for our podcast today. So as we always do, let's get started with some introductions. I'll start with you, Wayne. You are back on the podcast again to talk about another really fun topic. So Wayne, if you'd like to introduce yourself to our audience, that would be fantastic.
Sure. My name is Wayne Stewart, and I'm the Vice President Global for IoT and AI with Intertek, looking after all things sort of cybersecurity related and AI related. So happy to be here again today.
Yes, happy to have you back as a repeater. And then very excited, of course, Nico, to have you on your first podcast here on Medical Compliance with Clarissa. You're new to our team here at Intertek, so it'd be great to have an introduction to yourself and your background and what you were doing.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. So I'm Nico Schmidt. I just joined Intertek 2 months ago. I'm an AI engineer, so my background is machine learning, and I did a lot of time spending at Volkswagen building AI for autonomous cars, actually. And some 2 years ago, I exited and open up to a broader area of sectors to do AI quality, not only for automotive, but also across other sectors, and building up a quality assurance package now at Intertek.
Yes, wonderful to have you both. And of course, if anyone hasn't guessed, our topic today is of course going to be related to all things AI with a little bit of cyber flavor thrown in there. You know, AI in the medical space is something that has been around for quite a while, but of course we're seeing it become more and more popular, kind of snowballing in terms of what we're seeing, uses of AI and the application of AI in medical products and devices, which is really what we're going to focus on today. Of course, we're seeing AI across all of our different industries and across all of the different areas where we operate. But today we'll get into some of the nuances and specifics with what we're seeing with med devices and products. So Wayne, I'm going to kick it off with you and ask, we see that there's a lot of different applications of AI, as I mentioned, but what do you see as some of the most common applications that we're seeing in medical devices today?
Yeah, I think, as you said, there's a lot of different applications for medical devices today. It includes everything from image recognition with radiology to real-time analytics for wearable patient monitors. But I think the biggest area is sort of this diagnostic support area, if I can say that a little bit more broadly and generally. It's basically using AI to sort of flag anomalies in medical images or medical data. Think MRI, CT scans, X-rays, that kind of thing. And it really, it's using AI to help, let's say, radiologists be able to work faster and diagnose more accurately at the end of the day. And it's an approach that can be used outside of just sort of medical imaging. It's being used in cardiology with monitoring ECGs. And we're also starting to see AI being used in basically for insulin to measure like the dosing for insulin in a sort of a smarter way based on real-time feedback from the patient's monitoring. So I think this is just the tip of the iceberg, and it's going to continue to grow. So it's a super exciting time to be involved in that space.
Yeah, I think you hit it right on the head, right? We're kind of at this precipice, right? We've seen a lot of AI products that have been cleared over the years, right? It's not new for medical device manufacturers to be using AI or MLMD, right? It's not a new thing, right? We've seen tons of devices cleared by the FDA, 1,000-ish devices, right, that have been cleared. But I think it's now this move from some of the traditional, like, predictive AI ways to more generative AI to just like the really amazing things that will allow doctors and physicians and clinicians more time to do their jobs because they can use AI as a tool. And especially as we see, people exiting the profession and people exiting the field and doctors retiring, right? Any tools that we can get to help the healthcare system move along, right, makes such a big difference. And so I think, as you say, it's just a really exciting time to kind of be involved and see, okay, what is going to be next? Like, what does this mean? Yeah. So when you think about the product development lifecycle, right, are you seeing medical device manufacturers integrating AI early on? Are we seeing kind of this plugging in AI as a solution on the back end? Like, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I think it's the early on is the right way to look at it. It's being AI in when it's included in a medical device is really in being included as part of the overall product development lifecycle, and it's sort of by necessity because there are new considerations and new risks that need to be worked into it along the way. It starts off with just coming up with the idea, what's the problem that we're trying to solve, and what is the data that we have available, and then building models using that data in a way that ultimately can benefit patient care and patient outcomes. Now, with all of these risks, we're seeing the risk management being adapted as well. So, at least from my experience, we saw traditional medical device risk management, having a very sort of well-known structure and approach from a medical device manufacturer perspective, and then it shifted. It was, I'd say, stretched to include cyber risks as more and more devices became connected, and now we're seeing it being extended again to include these sort of AI-based risks, and so it's really key that it's integrated into the development process from the very beginning, because as you identify those risks, those become your design constraints, and those become your test cases that you need to follow up on. So it's essentially it's not ideal to bolt it on as a technology or as a solution, but to have it well planned out right from the beginning.
Yeah, and I think you said something right. And I've sat through a lot of these digital health sessions and AI sessions at different conferences and different industry events. And it's the idea of identifying the problem and what you're trying to fix rather than saying, oh, we have an AI solution and how do we plug that in somewhere? It's right. No, you need to identify the problem or what you're trying to fix in the first place and then see if AI can work, right? Rather than saying, oh, we have this amazing AI. Let's see if we can use this to do X, Y, and Z. So true. And I think, talking about risk management, talking about the risks that are associated, obviously that's something that comes into play with cyber, with AI, with these digital products. You're introducing all of these different types of risks that are outside of just hardware risks, mechanical risks. Right now, you're having to look at things much broader reaching.
Yeah, absolutely. And like I said, it's this evolution of risk as we bring in new technology. With new technology is new risk and new quality requirements, new testing requirements. So it's a life cycle approach.
Yeah, and I want to know from both of your perspective, right? Like, what are the most common types of AI models that we're seeing in this space? And maybe, Wayne, you can talk a little bit about what we're seeing in the medical space, and Nico, if there's other types of AI models that we're seeing elsewhere. Just interesting to know, like, what we're seeing and why maybe manufacturers are choosing certain types of AI models.
Sure. From what I've seen, it's really about supervised learning is sort of the base for it. So it's taking known data sets, labeled data sets, and building models from that. So think of diagnostic images where they've already been labeled as not cancer and cancer, and then being able to build models based on that. And we see that using neural networks for image processing, and the neural networks really kind of take the images and almost mirror the way the brain works. It identifies sort of objects within the images and the edges of the objects and the patterns of those objects. And then over the course of training with thousands and thousands and thousands of images, it can then be used to really predict that pattern. And this is essentially called like a deep learning approach. It's one of the forms of AI. And then you have other sort of decision tree based models that are used. And this is better for like structured data, so like clinical results, lab results, things of that nature. And it's more of a traditional machine learning approach. You're typically going to have maybe a bunch of smaller models kind of processing the data, coming to a certain outcome, and then as it comes to that outcome, almost a voting mechanism on the ultimate outcome of that pattern. And this is a type of model that works very fast, and it's really good for being like an auditable decision. Like, so the provability of how you got to that conclusion is very strong with those types of models. You know, we're also seeing, I think, more large language models being used, LLMs, but typically that's used for or by physicians to help generate notes, and it's less used, I'd say, in the sort of regulated medical device space. You know, primarily because the validation, the explainability of the more traditional machine learning models is more straightforward, I would say.
Yeah.
But I don't know if Nico, if you have anything to build on that one.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, obviously, each task you want to solve has a kind of type of model that fits to the data, right? Because every task has different data for images, as you said. Neural networks, especially convolutional neural networks, are the right approach. Now more transformer based, but it really depends. Structured data, as you said, go with random forests or gradient boosting. And if you have time series like heart rates or whatever time series you would have, then you go rather for recurrent neural networks or LSTMs. So it really depends on the data type. And fitting the right, or finding the right model that fits, that can process this kind of data and produce the right predictions with it.
Yeah, so you could be using multiple models, right, within a system.
Yes.
Yeah. So when we think about this, you know, with using single models or multiple models and what manufacturers are doing, I think one of the big questions that comes up at a lot of these like industry events and conferences that I've been at, as I said, you know, even with the regulators, there's always this discussion on how are manufacturers training the AI models, right? Especially when you're dealing with patient data, you know, personal information, sensitive medical data, or, you know, test cases that are scarce, so you don't have big populations. Like how do we see manufacturers training these models in a way that, you know, makes the benefit worth the risk?
Yeah, I think there's a big problem. I mean, privacy and scarcity of privacy. There are, of course, methods, right? You can use technical methods to anonymize the data or pseudonymize the data, if that's possible. There are a bit more advanced approaches like doing federated learning, so to train basically where the data is, not leaving their origin, training on multiple sites like multiple hospitals, for example, or wherever the data is generated. So reducing the risk of that data spreading around or leaving its purpose, basically. But then there are also more advanced mechanisms like differential privacy, homomorphic encryption. That's really advanced, and there I think the medical industry is very thoughtful of new ideas of how to deal with this problem. The other question of scarcity is typically, or in some use cases, we have only little amounts of data. And usually for machine learning, more data is always better, right? So if you have more data, you can create more accurate models, more generalizing models that generalize across different populations, so groups of people. And to get around this, there's also some methods, for example, using synthetic data as an add-on to the real data that you have. For example, using augmentation to change the existing data a little bit, replicating this existing data, and always have a copy that is slightly different. So the main context and characteristics stay the same, but the appearance is different, and so the model gets the model that's trained on that data gets to see more diversity and is supposed to generalize better. Now we see a lot of Gen AI technologies emerging, and they are getting better and better, not only in the text domain, but also on images, for example, and other modalities. So this is also a big opportunity for medical device and data creators to add new data on top, synthetic data generated with AI models. That's really interesting. And beyond that, there are a few approaches like transfer learning. That's actually a quite common one. So where you take a base set of data that is not exactly your use case, but it's sufficiently similar, and you have a lot of that, so you can train a base model on that and then fine-tune on your special use case with a small sample that you have, and fine-tune the model towards your specific use case to be very good at that.
Yeah, and I love this discussion. And again, of course, the discussion about data comes up so much, especially in the medical space with all of the clinical data, right? And there's so many discussions that have been had over, how do we make sure that there's not bias and how do we have patient diversity? And we know in the medical space already, right? So much of the data that is collected is on, Caucasian males of a certain age, right? So even the data that they have that they are actually generating via clinical trials, right? They're not having a diverse population subset in terms of age, in terms of gender, right? And so how they're addressing that and how you can use AI in a really powerful way, right, is amazing. But you still have this whole question around the actual data itself, right? And, are there concerns around synthetic data, or are there concerns around, open source data? And especially if you're taking that to make a clinical trial or clinical assumptions, right? And how you address that from a manufacturer side to prove efficacy, right?
Yeah, exactly. That's very interesting. And there are mechanisms right now where the manufacturers partner with the data providers, like different hospitals or academic research institutions, to kind of make deals or make partnerships to get hands on those data. And of course, under strict usage agreements or so, to kind of have a regulatory kind of hand on it, but still being able to source from multiple places. They cannot generate the data themselves. And it goes so far that there are even vendors or data aggregators that have a broking kind of function to source data from different places and sell it to others, or license the data to other manufacturers, and there's a whole market around that. That's very interesting.
Yeah.
But as you said, there's also public data sets, and it's all about the research institutes creating those, usually in also greater consortium where they have research projects on certain topics, creating this data, sharing this data, and also sharing it with the public if they can sufficiently anonymize it.
Yeah. What was super interesting too, I was at CES earlier this year and sat through a couple of the digital health sessions, and you had people from across the industry coming together and talking about how the industry should be able to come together. So you had key players from a lot of the large medical device manufacturers saying, how powerful can we be together if you're collecting this data, or you have this data and we have this data, or across the hospital networks, as you talk about, right? And, what can we do as an industry that could be so powerful with all of this data that exists in different formats, in different places, stored in different ways, but you have everybody working towards the same goal, saying, how can we share this data? How can we use this data for the greater good? Especially across some of these large manufacturers, right, where they have all of this data, and then you have some of the smaller startups, really exciting new technologies, right? How do we come together as an industry and say, we have access to all of this information that's all there. Now, how do we get it together in a way that's usable and can really make a difference in how, clinical outcomes, patient care, right, all of these things?
Yeah, that's exactly very interesting. And the second point you mentioned about the data needs to be addressing the use case, right? But it also needs to be representative of what you want to solve in the end of the use case. So it needs to be diverse, need to be representative, and this means you have to deal with biases. And in this respect, there's a certain steps you have to take basically before you can say what you do about bias. you need to have a fairness concept built into the data. Identifying which groups might be at risks and which metrics to use to measure fairness. And then you go into testing the data, first of all, whether the data has the right distribution, for example, has all groups similarly represented. And then you go into, after you train the model with that data, to test the model outcomes and see if they perform in the same way on all those at-risk groups, basically. And if that doesn't show kind of equal performance, then you have to do some mitigation, right? And this usually means pre-processing of data, doing sampling in a specific way to have skewed distribution, or using augmentation, as I said earlier, to modify the data distribution to your usage. And then there also, you can also on the training side do something like weighting the data differently during training, so your model gets already a notion of this distribution of that data, and that's kind of the methods that are usually used. And interestingly, regulations like the UAI, for example, also prescribe these kind of methods around and concepts around bias handling.
Yeah, and I think, the other discussion and thing that you mentioned there too is this idea of the performance of the models and the AI algorithms, right? And how does a manufacturer, as we're concerned about performance and as we're concerned about how they're working, right? How do you validate in a real world setting, right, these different environments, right? How do you validate these AI algorithms, especially if you're doing something that's maybe a little bit more high risk or maybe could have, different potential outcomes? Like, how do you as a manufacturer say, okay, we're going to look at the performance of this algorithm and we can validate that it's safe, but at some point you have to test it in a real world environment. So are there things that we're seeing that, medical device manufacturers have been able to do, or in other industries as well? And I guess this is kind of a question for both of you, are there things that we've seen in the med space when we're trying to validate AI algorithms, or in other spaces as well?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, in clinical trials, you have that in medical for a long time already with statistics, right? You have similar problems, but with AI, usually you start with testing the model internally where you train it, and having some key concepts like splitting the data into training validation test sets, so that you don't test your system on the data you have trained it on, because then, of course, the model knows the data already, and that might be cheating and not representing what you might see in the real world out there. And there are methods like cross-validation and so on to deal with that. And then there might be also a chance of doing external testing. So I also read that institutions cross-validate their models against each other if they have similar use cases. So the data is a bit different, and you get a better notion of whether that's generalizing to other data as well. But then in the real-world testing, if you really have a device, then typically I think what's done is to have some kind of shadow mode, so to have the system tested without letting it do the decision, but just monitoring for a while whether it's good in performance and whether it's not too far away from what you expect, and then pilot it with a small amount of a smaller group and roll out slowly until you fully release the model to the mass, right? And then, of course, ongoing measuring the impact of that. And of course, in medical, there's also regulatory constraints and prescribed validation. Like in many use cases, you have to submit your data to, for example, FDA or under to certain bodies that check it under the FDA or medical device regulation in use. So you have a regulatory mechanism as well. And after you release it, of course, continuous performance monitoring, through tracking of metrics, through data drift and model drift detection, mechanisms, and also doing regular checks, regular audits. This is the way they typically go.
Yeah, any thoughts from your side, Wayne?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to that very briefly. From a post-market performance monitoring and validation perspective, manufacturers are really building in those monitoring tools into their systems, so that, as Nico said, you're monitoring for drift or any kind of real-world evidence that there's a failure in the model. So maybe that's doing sort of statistical analysis of real world results. But it also can be like clinical feedback loops. So having the clinician, the doctor being able to sort of respond to the results in real time, to identify any kind of inaccuracy. And at the end of the day, if they see that the performance is dropping, or if there's any kind of drift, then the manufacturer is going to have to investigate that, understand what's happening, and that might mean retraining a model. It might mean resetting to a sort of known safe state in order to ensure consistent long-term performance of the AI system.
Yeah, a complicated issue for sure, but I think it's something that is obviously so critical, especially with these types of products and devices and the algorithms that are being used. Well, you guys, we could talk about AI and medical devices all day. This has been such a good discussion. So I really appreciate both you, Nico and Wayne, for joining. I'm sure there will be a part 2 and a follow-up with more discussion on AI and medical devices. We also have our webinar that's available, as well as our white paper. So if you're looking for more information, definitely check that out. And if you have any questions, of course, you can always contact us directly. Thanks so much, you guys, for joining today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really a pleasure to be on this.